Thank you all for joining us and being a part of our webinar again this month. I've got the great pleasure of having Corey Cole join us from our Melbourne office. Welcome, Corey.
Hi, Ashley. Hi, everyone.
Looking all smick and span there. And but before we get stuck into today's topic, we just thought in terms of a couple of updates and bits and pieces that are going on in the marketplace. I think for most of you who are coming from the accounting side of things, you would have had the great pleasure of getting a whole bunch of letters and inboxes to the MyGovs of your clients about these minuscule debts that have come out. I think one of the interesting things about that is that it's all been added, but the ATO have said that they're not planning to legally pursue those debts specifically. But if if they've got refunds or anything like that, then they're going to take it all off that. I think outside that, there's no doubt that the ATO and banks are increasing their activity. We're certainly seeing through the court lists some increased activity, and for those who are at our in-person seminars a couple of months ago, we spoke about that the amount of claims that were happening in the courts that hadn't got to wind up or bankruptcy. We're now starting to see that flow starting to come through. So there is certainly an increase in activity, and we've certainly got a lot more people calling us up now with creditor stat demands and bankruptcy notices, which is, I think, a sign of what's going to happen over the coming next 6 to 12 months. So that's probably about all I've got from an update point of view. So we'll jump into the topic for today. As I mentioned, I've got Corey who's joining us today as a strategist here in Melbourne. Corey's been with me 10 years. He was first employee that we brought into the Melbourne office once I moved down here, and he's still putting up with me to this day. So
I think it's you're putting up with me, but anyway.
But he certainly comes with a wealth of experience. So we'll get into some really interesting matters today. But Corey, just for those who don't know you in other parts of the country, do you want to give a little bit of a brief on you?
Sure. So prior to joining Ashley and Hank at Jonge Read, I after a little career break, before that I was working for insolvency firms, managing liquidations and bankruptcies, and also undertaking forensic accounting engagements and valuations. So I did that for about 15 years, and then saw the light and decided to join the good side and come here and work with Ashley.
Yeah, we've had a bit of fun. A mad family man with 4 bloody kids. I don't know how you put up with it and do it every day. I got 2, and that's more than enough for me. But anyway, all right. So let's jump in, Corey, and get into the fun stuff. So the first one that we're going to talk about today is something that, on the surface, is a pretty simple restructure. There are a few twists and turns which we'll get into. And like we've had with a lot of strategy or a lot of clients who have come to us, it's actually started on the back of a bit of a legal matter, and people needed to find a way of dealing with it. So it started from a situation, as I say, with many from the legal point of view, but obviously had a few more twists and turns. So why don't I let you jump in and give a bit of a background on this one?
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks a lot. As you mentioned, the reason the client came to us was because of a legal dispute that had been going on for 8 years. Now, they lost the legal dispute, despite the fact that the lawyer said they were going to win. Obviously, that's always the way. Yeah, oh, you're going to win. It had cost them, up until that hearing date, it had cost them about $1.6 million in legal fees.
Wow.
Yeah. And they lost the case, which means that they're probably going to get court cost orders against them for the other side's legal costs as well. So that'd be similar. Now, the actual claim against them was about $8 million, although the actual quantification of that amount has yet to come down, has yet to be given by the judge. Now, the business itself is an international company that had a turnover of over $25 million, and the actual legal dispute resulted from copyright infringement.
Right.
So something that we don't hear about a lot of the time, but it's certainly very important, the intellectual property of the company, and unfortunately they lost that claim.
Right. So we had a claim coming down the pipe for about $8 million, and it was obviously going to be the death nail for the business if we didn't come up with a plan. So, so what did you have as a plan?
Well, it wasn't, funnily enough, the claim wasn't just against the company. The creditor had also, or the supplier had also joined in the director personally. So not only did we have to look at, and the director was also liable for the same amount as the company, so around about $8 million. And so our plan had to address both the company and him personally.
Right. Okay. So that's certainly taken up a notch.
Yes, it certainly did. So we often talk about restructuring businesses, and in this case, we advised that doing a complete restructure of the business was the best way forward. Whilst at the same time, we also said that the director also needed to go bankrupt, as he simply didn't have the divisible assets to be able to pay the $8 million claim.
Right. So as I said on the outset, sounds like a pretty simple, do a restructure, put them into bankruptcy. It's something that's relatively bread and butter in what we do in dealing with companies. But normally, you know, and we get this quite a lot, particularly when people go and see other advisors, is that, you know, for a business of this size with 25 mil turnover, a little bit international, you know, that you'd normally look at a VA and a DOCA for that sort of thing. Why would we have not taken that more traditional path?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And you're right, there is a misconception that restructures are for smaller companies, but not in this case. As you know, when we do our assessment of the situation, we look at all options and all issues to determine the best way forward. One of the real issues in this case was that the aggrieved creditor was not obviously happy, and they were very aggressive as they'd fought in the British High Court, then in the Victorian Supreme Court. If we went down a VA DOCA route, we would have needed this creditor's support to get the DOCA voted up. Right. and effectuated, as they were the major, apart from the secured creditor, who we'll come to in a minute, they were the main unsecured creditor. So we were never going to get a voluntary administration / deed of company arrangement.
Yeah, get
successful.
Yeah. And I think that's the point, isn't it? Is that when you're looking at these things, you've sort of actually got to look at, you know, I think I've talked about it 100 times about starting with the end in mind and how critical it is to do that. So, and after such a long fight, I don't suppose they would support any type of compromise, because they probably thought that they were going to get the 8 million.
Yeah, and actually, with the value of hindsight, there is no doubt they wanted them gone, but I'll get to that.
Fair enough. Okay, so that sounds interesting, but let's just keep working through this. So you had a restructure that needs to have a sale agreement put in place. So we need valuations for both plant and equipment and goodwill. I can imagine that was a bit of a simple process with an international business.
Actually, it wasn't. It was actually quite complex and very time-consuming. The business owned a number of international trademarks, which were obviously registered internationally on the various IP, intellectual property sites for the respective countries. But we all needed to have the valuations completed on every single one of them. Plus, the business ran a model where it had some consignment stock and some stock owned outright. So we had multiple locations across numerous international countries to locate and track down the stock. The plant and equipment, in theory, should be an easy component of the valuation. However, in this case, it was all over the place. So what we needed to work with some true professionals in this space to be able to achieve what we needed to be undertaking the engagement. and we were able to separate what needed to be separated and had it valued in preparation for the sale and effectively the liquidation. However, the really tricky part was the goodwill valuation.
Okay, so you're saying tracking down international trademarks and getting them valued internationally, tracking down stock all over the world and plant and equipment all over the world was, now you're saying that's the easier part than goodwill. Please explain that.
So, as people guess, with this next statement, this is a very recent job. Now, the last 3 trading years has been abnormal for the business, as it's been for most businesses. Without giving the identity of the business away, they operated in a market that was heavily impacted with the shutdowns around the world, specifically with a lot of the orders for homeschooling. That really impacted the business severely. The demand for their product went through the floor. Bear in mind, they were the market leader, both here and in the UK. And the long-term impact of the trends in their market meant that there was no certainty as to how the industry would recover, or even if it would go back to previous levels pre-COVID.
Okay, so I understand the need to be a little bit vague because this isn't a fully completed job as such as yet. But so we'll move on. But in this case, how did you have to handle things?
So the issue was, for the goodwill valuation, if you accept the premise that the last 3 years were abnormal, a goodwill valuation could attempt to exclude the period from the value of the calculation and determine the value of the business based on the history of the business pre-COVID. Now, in our case, the value of the business would have been exceptionally high if that would have occurred, and we would have made it very difficult to complete a sale because of the value just would have been unattainable.
Yeah.
The truth is, though, the business had fundamentally changed because of COVID, and those changes will, in their belief, will never go back to being what they were pre-COVID.
Yeah.
So we needed to talk to the director to provide detailed information to the valuer to ensure that the current value of the business was adopted. There was no point undertaking the restructure if the sale was overvalued.
Yeah, so and I think it's important to note that we always use an independent valuer, but it doesn't mean that we can't be involved in discussions to get them to understand a point of view, or the point of view of where the business is at. And I know we're having a lot of issue with it at the moment with some valuers who are just going, I'm going to cut this 3 years out. I've never been a believer that we're going to go back to the old, and we have a lot of clients who have been sitting there waiting for the world to go back to 2019. We're not in 2019 anymore, and we're not going to be there. The business and the whole business structure has changed, and this whole premise of going back doesn't work. But when you're a valuer, all you do is get to look at the old stuff. So it does take quite a bit of effort to get them to understand and see that this point of view in some cases. So anyway, I'll let you keep going on the valuation and the impact that it has.
Thanks, Ashley. So after significant work, we were able to obtain a valuation that allowed us to work towards completing the sale. There was, however, another significant hurdle now that we had the valuation and were able to quantify the sale of business.
It's probably not going to be much of a case study if we only had one issue to talk about.
No, it's not.
So what else have you got, mate?
So we also had a significant secured creditor, a Big Four bank, involved in the business. Now, the company had banking facilities to the tune, so they actually owed $6 million.
Wow, okay. So that's certainly an issue. And for those who may not know, obviously a bank, if they've got lending into the company, they can have an all-PAP in place. all present and after acquired. Part of our favourite conversations around PPSRs. But what it means for us when we're looking at a restructure is that if a company has an all-PAP in place, you can't affect the sale of business without their approval. And normally banks, when these type of things come up, they just want to be paid out and moved on. So, but I'm guessing if they didn't have the money to pay 8 million back to a legal case, they weren't going to have 6 million to pay out the bank. So what happened with that, Corey?
So first off, Ashley, I should say the bank was well secured. Not only did they have all PAPs, as you said, which gave them access to the assets of the company, which included substantial assets and significant debtors, but they also had personal property security in terms of the director's properties he had secured against the facilities. This meant that if the bank wanted to foreclose, they could on the company, and they could also repossess the personal assets, and they would be paid out in full. Now, often in these cases, the banks stand to lose if they don't play along, but in this case, they were well covered. Now, the key to this is that our client did have a good relationship with the bank. As a matter of fact, a very good relationship with the bank. And because the director was open and honest, and because of the past dealings, the bank were interested in actually continuing to support him and his business. Okay. So therefore, we entered into negotiations with the credit team, with the at the respective bank, to support the restructure.
Right. So how did that go?
So obviously, there's a $6 million debt. So we asked that they set up a new lending facility in the new company. The new company would, or the new facility, sorry, in the new company would effectively pay out the old facility and would also form part of the sale, meaning that the new company would pay in full for the purchase of the business and effectively pay out the old facility. Now, by providing all the valuations for the trademarks, intellectual property, plant and equipment, stock, goodwill, the bank could see that the purchase price was fair and reasonable, and more importantly, commercial. Eventually, we were able to get them to support the transaction once they'd done their own independent review of all our documentation, and they did actually have an independent auditor go through our valuations to make sure that they were accurate.
Right. Okay. Well, that's pretty cool. So effectively, the bank transferred their debt to the new entity, but because we don't use the word transfer, effectively they used our sale agreement to refinance into the new co and then pay out their facility in the old co.
In very simple terms, that is what happened. Yes.
I know it's simple terms, but $6 million facilities don't get moved overnight without too much drama. Okay, so once we had the sale had been effected, the bank had moved their bank's debt had been moved over. So we had an old shell that still had the legal case against it. I assume it would just go straight into liquidation from there?
Well, actually, yes, that is right. But again, there was more to this liquidation than most.
Do tell, keep going, mate.
Well, the supplier behind the legal action was not just sitting around through this process. They continued to aggressively pursue their claim. This meant that we knew they were going to be very, very unhappy when we effectively pulled the rug out from underneath them. So not only did we have to prepare for the liquidation and the restructure, we needed to prepare for further legal fights, which we were sure were going to come down the line.
So let's jump forward then. So the company went into liquidation, did all the preparation for the legal fights. Was it needed?
Yeah, it was. and the fight certainly came. So 3 days after the company went into liquidation, and it was a creditor's voluntary liquidation, I'll just clarify that. Now, the creditor went to the Supreme Court and commenced freezing order applications, and it was on a Friday afternoon, of all things. which
Has there ever been a freezing order not happen on a Friday afternoon?
no, I don't think so. Now we had predicted this, but the director had sort of got into a false sense of security by the fact it hadn't happened by 2 o'clock on the Friday afternoon, that perhaps we might have got away with it. But
Right.
what they were seeking and what they attempted to do was to have orders placed on the new company, so the new trading entity which had purchased the business from the old business, from the old company. So they wanted orders on the new company, the old company, the director, and for some reason his wife as well. And to this day, there's been no explanation to why they were putting it on their wife when she's not a party to any of the transactions. So given that we knew that this was coming, we'd already had the documentation ready to go and already had a lawyer briefed so that they were familiar with the circumstances surrounding the freezing order.
Right, okay. So I guess they'd hope to trump you by doing the freezing order on the Friday afternoon. You'd have no time to get all your documents ready and be ready to fight the case.
Yeah, you're probably right, Ashley, but we did have it all ready, and it was just a matter then of lodging it. But look, the long story short of everything was that the application for the freezing order was dismissed, and the court allowed the liquidator to do their job and continue on as they ordinarily would in the ordinary course of undertaking the liquidation. None of the freezing orders on the director or the wife's assets were allowed to remain.
Very cool. So how did the client handle that though? Like, you know, I mean, you mentioned that you'd spoken to him about it, but as most of our people listening would know, when people are going through this for the first time, it would be super challenging for them to handle all of this.
Yeah, it was. But given that we'd already predicted that this could happen, he was okay by it. And I think that's probably because of the legal fights he'd previously been through with the creditor. He knew within himself that they were very aggressive and litigious. So there was no surprise when the freezing order came, given we'd already planned for it and put substantial measures in place to fight it.
Yeah.
In fact, he was almost excited about it because we'd planned for it, and he already knew that we already had the documents and everything ready to go with the lawyer, so that we could hit him back straight away.
Almost felt like he was going to have a win against them.
Essentially, yes, yeah, that he was going to have another win within 3 days. So he was happy about that.
Right. So given that you had all those issues in the restructure, you mentioned at the start that you also needed to plan for his bankruptcy. Was that how did that go in comparison?
Well, look, it's gone reasonably well. There haven't been too many surprises, although the supplier has already issued a bankruptcy notice against our client. So that was to be expected, and that's just about their last resort. But I would say it's nearly done. But in comparison to the liquidation, it's certainly going well. I'm not sure yet, but I think we'll be finally getting them to understand that's the supplier and the client, that we can plan a good game as well as them.
It can be a little bit of the fun of this game sometimes. And it's, I call it a game, and I don't want anyone to think we take it lightly, but having the ability to trump some of these strategies can certainly be very rewarding in the process. So, well, to say that's an interesting one's an understatement, and the fact that we've tried to do it in a couple of minutes makes I'm sure there was a lot more detail and fun and stuff in it. But I guess one of the things that one of the reasons why we wanted to highlight this one is that it's not always just about coming up with a plan. So we talk about, for everyone listening, we talk about that Jonge Read always provides our obligation and cost-free written plan. Coming up with a plan is only one part of the issue. And a restructure and a bankruptcy, for anyone would probably sound like that's the normal thing to do in a scenario like this. But the devil's in the detail. And that's certainly one thing that we pride ourselves on as a firm, is that we are exceptional at the implementation of these plans. And I think that's a really key part of what, again, for those listening, to understand that it's not always the fact that we've got the greatest minds, and Hank and I talk about it all the time. We do have some of the greatest minds in this space, but it's the implementation of it and using those minds to make sure that it actually works the way that we want. So we'll talk about another interesting matter now, Corey. We'll jump to one which, I think probably in my 15 or 17 years in the game now, we probably only this would only be the second time we've tried to use this strategy. And but this one was for a restaurant chain. For obvious reasons, we all know how much fun restaurants have had in recent years. But each of the restaurants were actually held in separate companies. Was that right?
Yeah, there were there. So there were 15 trading restaurants, and there were 15 separate companies.
Right. So I know they're dealing with a lot of restaurants, wines, and cafes at the moment because of all the fun that's happened in the last few years. But restructuring 15 at once would put a fair burden on a business and the director, I would think.
Yeah, it would. It'd be a great concern, I think, to them, because they wouldn't. They certainly wouldn't probably be able to keep up with us, because we'd move at such a fast pace. But with this case, though, we decided to do something different rather than do 15 individual restructures.
Right. So, well, go on, mate. Tell us the story.
So the group was under a fair bit of stress, and unfortunately, like most businesses, they've used the ATO as an unofficial overdraft to help them get through. The interesting thing in this one was that although each of the restaurants was in their own separate company, they shared a majority of the same creditors: suppliers, service providers, and even landlords. All of the restaurants were in various positions across 3 states, I think, but all bar 2 had the same ultimate landlord. The reason this was of interest was that if we were to do these as separate restructures, which could be done, it would put a huge cost impost on the group.
Right. So, and I've already mentioned that you've got a fairly unique solution coming up. So why don't you just jump into what that was to get around it?
Well, it's not. I wouldn't say it's unique. It's probably a little bit different. But we're looking doing a what's called a joint or a pooling voluntary administration and deed of company arrangement. Now, what that means is that we look to put all the restaurants effectively under one administration. That is, we put all 15 companies under one administrator, but as a single administration, not 15 of them. So okay, essentially, we pool all the companies into one group.
Okay, so we've talked in previous webinars about running two, running 2 voluntary administrations at the same time. Often talking about the timing of it, that you need to do one first and the other one second. But if I'm hearing this correctly, you're pulling it all into one meeting?
Yes, that is the idea. All 15 companies' administration would run as one.
Right.
You don't often get the opportunity to do that, as there is a high bar in regard to common creditors. If creditors are not effectively the same, then you can't do it. Obviously, the ATO is a common creditor, but in this case, although the restaurants operated independently from a purchasing point of view, they used their buying power to get deals for the group. The creditors all dealt with companies individually, but I guess it was like under a collective bargaining agreement.
Right. So all of them are using the same suppliers to get their food goods and all that sort of stuff to a large extent. Yeah.
Yeah. So the same meat supplier, same fruit and veg supplier, etc.
Right.
Now, landlords were also an interesting one. It turned out that because the business model was to operate in major shopping centres, as you know, there are very few large multinationals that own most of they own most of the large shopping centres, such as Vicinity and Westfield. So the benefit of using the joint VA approach is that it allows for a single administration process, which minimises the cost for the client. It allowed us to make one offer to address all creditors across the group. Sorry, that's unsecured creditors across the group.
Yeah.
This meant that we did not run the risk of getting some of the deeds up and others falling over and having to go into liquidation. It either all worked or it all failed.
Right. So, I mean, not only did we have the cost benefit for the client of not having to do 15 separate VA or restructures or whichever method we might have taken, but you also had a little bit more of control because it, you know, we were either all in or all out.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So, and the bar, you mentioned that it needed to be a high bar to get over. So you wouldn't see this very often, but you know, where you've got some of these grouped companies, it could be a very valuable tool.
Absolutely, especially if they all owe money to the ATO, which is usually the number one creditor. As a matter of fact, I hardly ever see
part. Yeah.
that is the easy part. I think you hardly ever see where there's no ATO creditor, but they also need other common creditors. So you can't have 15 meat suppliers across the 15 companies. Realistically, there only needed to be one meat supplier.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and that's what essentially it was in this case.
Yeah, okay. And I guess that also helps because you've got, you know, these suppliers are heavily caught up in an entire group. So getting their support to come up with a compromise on the way through. We all know that the ATO can be a little bit difficult to deal with, but they are being a lot more supportive, particularly in industries that they know are affected by COVID. But having all the other suppliers will make it a lot easier when we're putting together the plan for the vote. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right, well, mate, thank you. I mean, I know personally that one's still going through the process, but it's certainly a very interesting, different model to have a look at. We've got a little bit of time, so I might. I'm going to quiz you on one that I know that you've been involved in, but we haven't talked about a lot for today. But it is interesting because there's a few bits and pieces in it that a lot of people wouldn't be aware of. So this one was it was the deceased estate. It was an accounting practice. I'll get you to give it a 2-minute overview on what it was.
So most people think if you're an accountant and you're doing asset planning for clients, you yourself would have a good succession plan and you would have a will and you would have partnerships agreement between your two partners. Well, unfortunately, like mechanics who always have cars that break down, in this case, the accountants had none of everything they'd been preaching. Yeah. So the founding partner died. The other director said suddenly, but the guy was 82, so he'd done all right with himself.
82 is still young.
and he was turning up to work every single day, but he died without a number of things in place. He didn't have a will. There was no partnership agreement between him and his other business partner, despite the fact they'd been in partnership since 2002. There was no succession plan in place. And plus there was still a substantial amount of debt to the secured creditor.
Right.
Plus at the same time having a rather substantial ATO debt.
And unfortunately, I think, well, I mean, ATO debt drives people to us a lot more than anything else, but it's unfortunate it's there. So when you've got a situation with one director who's gone, and you've got they've still owned the shares and you've got all that sort of stuff, and you've got a tax debt in play, what can we do to help? What did we do to help?
So we sat down with the surviving director, and he didn't want to be a sole practitioner practice, and he thought the best way to get a return back to his investment and his deceased business partner's investment was to try and integrate the firm into another accounting practice. Yeah. And which is essentially what he did, but the complexities of trying to do that and to sell a business or to merge a business into another operating entity, and when there was no will in place, made it a bit complex, as we had to wait for there to be an executor determined by the court, in which case it was the deceased director's son. So throughout this process, we're advising obviously the executor and the surviving director. But halfway through the project, the ATO issued director's penalty notices. Now, it didn't just go to the surviving director, it also was placed on the deceased director as well.
Okay, so I know some people would know it and others wouldn't, but so you can still have a DPN issued on effectively a dead person.
Yes. Yes, you can. It doesn't happen very often. We don't see it very often, but I know one of my colleagues, Terry, he's also heard of it recently as well. So if it's happened twice in recent times, then I'm assuming it's going to happen more.
Yeah.
And
if the circumstances prevail, but yeah. So
there are a couple of issues then that we had to try and overcome. One was obviously the ATO director's penalty notice and the funds that were still owed to the secured creditor. So we managed to and essentially the ATO was the only unsecured creditor in this case. So yeah. that did make things a little bit easier. But so how we essentially dealt with that was we got the best possible price we could for the accounting practice, and that was obviously based on their lodgements and their WIP and what the
all the stuff that everyone would know.
And it also meant helping the executor realise some of the deceased's personal assets, such as his primary residence, to make sure that the estate had paid its debts in full.
Yeah. Right. Well, we are starting to run out of time, and I know that we can just wrap it on with a whole bunch of stuff, because I think over the years you and I have certainly had some very fun and interesting cases. But mate, I will start you to think about where we'll get ready to wrap up. And if anyone's got any questions for Corey or myself, you can throw them in the chat or use the fancy raise your hand thing for those who know how to use that. But Corey, did you have sort of again, thank you for coming along. As we've been joking about most of this year, that I don't know that many of you have actually chosen to come on the webinar if you had a choice, but I'm glad you have. But do you have any final thoughts that you want to send out to the group?
Yeah, seeking advice from us early, and bear in mind that there's no charge for coming to meet with us, okay? Even if it's initial advice and nothing happens thereafter, there is no charge for coming to see us. So in my mind, there's nothing lost coming to speak to us early, because coming to speak to us early and planning is the key to a successful job. The more planning in place, the more successful the job will be.
You reckon everyone listening, I've got him trained well on the sales pitch? So look, thank you, Corey. I know it's outside out of your comfort zone to be on public display like this, but you do have some very interesting cases that are worth talking about. For me, as we lead into the questions, for anyone who may have them, one thing I would like to highlight is that, you know, the fact that we had these fairly unusual cases, we use us as a resource, so that if you've got some weird stuff going on with a client, don't be afraid to pick up the phone, have a chat to one of the team. It may not be that we can actually help, but we've seen a whole lot of weird stuff over the years, and we might be able to, if it's not something that we can help you with, we can guide you in the direction of where to go. But the insolvency can be used as a tool very effectively to help businesses and to help people get through to the other side of it. And I think the other big one for me is This whole belief that we're waiting to go back to the old is really just not going to happen. So be aware that you've got a lot of directors out there still who are waiting for it to get back to normal. You're going to start hearing them say after Christmas it's all going to be great. Unfortunately, I think all of the indications are that it's going to go the other way, not this way. Not that I'm an economist at any great level, but certainly all the trends are heading that way. So I will, I'll open up to anyone who may have some questions or thoughts. While we're doing that, we will have a webinar next month. I can't remember the date of it, but it'll be early enough that you'll still be able to join before all the Christmas cheer. So look out for that in our invites as they come out soon. I thank you all again for joining us. We don't seem to have a lot of questions, so that's good. The poll's been slammed up there, as it does. So again, be nice to Corey. He's a nice guy. So look, again, thank you. Really appreciate it. Please lean on us where you can or where you need to. We really do want to be a resource for all of you, as well as obviously helping your clients when the need arises. So thank you again for joining us. I'm rabbiting on to give everyone a chance to fill in the poll, but I think we're getting close to that. On that note, thank you. Have a great rest of November, and we'll see you in early December. So thank you all. Thanks, Rob. Okay. Cheers, everyone. Bye.